Okay, we're going to start right away. We want to make the best of the time that we have. And I want to say how exciting it is to have Anna, Michael, Laura, and James here. It's been a lot of work to put this together, but I have the feeling that this is a historical conversation, and we have also an amazing audience here. But it's also the 5th Actioning Summit we're claiming here, and we're trying to explore with people that we really admire, that we think that are crucial in this moment, and their voices are somehow helping many people here to think architecture and space and the built environment differently. The inseparability of theory, practice, and activism, but also thinking that any reality, it's a more than human reality, and how we address that. This is the 5th Actioning Summit. There will be 3 more, right, to come, and I will pass it to Barjan Polman, that has been curating this series.
Thank you, Andres, and good evening, everyone. It was already mentioned, I think it's a historical conversation we're about to witness. Good evening, everyone, or in the context of tonight's conversation, I should probably really say good evening, everything. As James Bridle, one of the speakers tonight, put us, everything is really everyone. So welcome to everything of you for what is the first Actioning Summit of the spring semester and the 5th summit overall. It was already said. When we last met before the winter break, we critically discussed the methodological questions around the scaling up of carbon sequestration with experts from the field. And before that, in these summits, we've so far discussed working collectively, we've discussed affordable housing, and we've discussed AI as well. And tonight, we're moving on to our next topic, which deals with the methodological questions of how to think through or as more than human intelligence. And as I probably don't need to emphasize here, we really have an incredible, really spectacular lineup of speakers. James Bridle, Michael Marder, Laura Tripaldi, and Anna Tsing. On top of that, we also have an incredible lineup of responses from GSAPP faculty, including Catherine Griffiths, Marina Otero, Lindy Roy, Anthony Vanky, and Michael Wang, who are all sitting there on the 3rd row. So my name is Bartjan Polman, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programming here at GSAPP. And as you may know, what is aimed at with these Actioning Summits is to discuss the how, the specific methodologies and specific knowledge used by experts on a range of different topics that we don't really consider isolated, but in fact are fully intersected. And tonight our 4 speakers will bring 4 unique angles, I would say, to the question of what constitutes intelligence. James Bridle is, of course, well known for their seminal work on the various forms of knowing and being that may constitute forms of planetary intelligence. Laura Tripaldi, who has extensively studied the intelligence of materials in her recent work, discusses the new paradigm of softness as a paradigm for what she calls agentized technologies. And I think crucial in the context of these summits is that for Tripaldi, softness also offers a paradigm for an actionable future. And similarly crucial, especially in the context of the School of Architecture, are Michael Marder's investigations on intertelligence and how to think vegetally, including the claim he once made that spatiality, or the spatiality of plants, in this case, has an agency. And lastly, of course, Anna Tsing's incredible work on multi-species landscapes and their entanglements with infrastructure, including her famous work on the Matsutake mushroom, and the project's Feral Atlas she co-edits with GSAPP faculty Feifei Su, who is sitting right here as well, and others, which really discusses those instances in which non-human entities become entangled with human infrastructures. So just a few words about how the evening will unfold. We will first hear from the speakers, and each will speak for about 15 minutes on their work. We'll start with Laura Tripaldi, then we'll hear from James Bridle, followed by Michael Marder, and lastly, Anna Tsing. So, and after these presentations, we will hear targeted questions from our respondents sitting there, and I will open it then up to the audience to ask questions as well. And because we have so many speakers, we'll try to keep a strict control of the time. So I want to introduce Amy, Amy, you should come. This is Amy, who will, there's a flag, so if the time is up, the flag will come up for the speakers, so that we know we need to conclude. And I will not do extensive bios, as I'm sure you much rather hear from all of them. And in any case, they're super famous and their biographies can easily be found online. But just quickly, Laura Tripaldi is a transdisciplinary researcher at the interface of science, technology, and speculative thinking, who is artist in residence, visiting clinical assistant professor of interactive media arts at NYU Shanghai. James Bridle is a writer, artist, and technologist. They are the author of A New Dark Age and Ways of Being, of course, and their artworks have been commissioned by galleries and institutions and exhibited worldwide and on the internet, and their writing has appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers, including Wired, The Guardian, and the Financial Times. Michael Marder is the Iker Basque Research Professor of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country and Senior Fellow at the Institute of Global Reconstruction in Berlin. And his work spans the field of environmental philosophy and ecological thought, political theory, and phenomenology. And Anna Tsing, lastly, is a professor in the Social Sciences Division, Anthropology Department at UC Santa Cruz. And among her many incredible writings, I want to, of course, point out the book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins, which came out a few years ago and has become an instant classic, I think. And then, of course, our respondents, Catherine Griffiths, an assistant professor of architecture here at GSAPP, who teaches in the computational design program. Marina Otero, an architect, curator, and researcher, winner of the Wheelwright Prize, and currently Dean's visiting assistant professor here at GSAPP. Lindy Roy, who teaches here as well and is the founder of Roy Studio. Anthony Vanky, an assistant professor here at GSAPP who teaches in the urban planning program, co-directs the Center for Smart Streetscapes, and is an affiliate of the Columbia Data Science Institute. And then, of course, Michael Wang, an artist who also teaches here and whose incredible work has been shown at the Prada Foundation, the Swiss Institute, Manifesta, and many, many other incredible exhibitions. So with that, this summit is officially open, and Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. In my talk today, I'd like to propose a vision of the future. Before I do this, however, I'd like to briefly introduce myself and explain where this vision is coming from. My name is Laura Tripaldi. I'm a researcher with a background in chemistry and material science, now working at the intersection of technology, philosophy, and speculative thinking. Throughout my experience as a scientist, my main focus has been that of engineering new materials capable of intelligently responding to their environment, from breaking down pollutants with sunlight to self-organizing for greater strength and resilience. These experiences of scientific research have led me to look at materials in a different light and to question the established idea of matter as a passive object of human manipulation. As I cultivated this personal revelation, I soon realized that I was not alone. Across the sciences and the humanities throughout the last 2 decades, a new perspective on our relationship with matter has emerged. Many phenomena in the world around us, previously regarded as thoughtless mechanistic processes, are now being understood as the product of subjective intelligence and agency. In this agential turn, our understanding of cognition expands beyond the human to embrace different manifestations and embodiments, from cephalopods to plants, from slime molds, and even inorganic materials. This agential materialism is founded on a renewed understanding of the tight entanglement between materiality, cognition, and ecology. When situating my contribution within this flourishing transdisciplinary debate, I am interested in the fundamental threshold where materials conventionally considered inert and passive become capable of feeling, acting, and learning. How does a droplet of water grow into an ice crystal whose structure uniquely responds to subtle fluctuations in temperature, humidity, and pressure? And how can a virus, a minuscule dead assemblage of protein and nucleic acids, intelligently self-replicate to the point of impacting entire organisms and populations? When, in other words, does mind end and matter begin? There seems to be a growing understanding shared by many scientists and philosophers alike that cognitive phenomena don't simply appear at the scale of the organism, but that all intelligence emerges from a stratification of material processes occurring in parallel at multiple scales. There might be a single mind unfolding from quantum entanglement to molecular storms, from self-organizing particles to cellular metabolism, from neural communication to human consciousness and beyond. I embrace neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's view that sensing is the most elementary variety of cognition. As a chemist and material scientist, I have been trained to recognize how even the most seemingly inert materials have ways of feeling and responding intelligently to the world around them. We're used to thinking about the material world as composed of unfeeling, hard objects, each with its clearly defined boundaries. But matter becomes more fuzzy, fluid, and sensitive the closer we look. A secret softness is hidden behind the seeming solidity of the material world. To quote philosopher Elizabeth Grosz, we cannot help but view the world in terms of solids as things, but we leave behind something untapped of the fluidity of the world. This renewed understanding of matter isn't simply a philosophical concern. If we embrace a view of matter not as a collection of passive, solid objects ready to be manipulated by humans, but as endowed with intrinsic sensitivity and agency, then the way we engage with materials in our practices, from technology to design, from architecture to art, should also change. Our imagination of technological futurity has been long dominated by hardness and speed, embodied in tough and unyielding materials such as steel or silicon. This technological hardness forces materials into a state of passivity, reducing them to unfeeling parts assembled and controlled by humans. What would it mean to imagine technologies of a different kind? As I mentioned earlier, in this talk I want to propose a vision of the future. Although we should be aware that speculations aren't enough to create structural change, they open a space where reality becomes softer and open to previously unthought possibilities. I invite you to imagine a future where softness, plasticity, permeability, and fluidity are at the heart of our technologies. This is a future where our technologies adapt and grow. Instead of passive tools of our human action, they can actively perceive and learn from their environments. Their structure is complex, but this complexity is managed autonomously, without the need for maintenance and top-down control. Because they work in continuity with spontaneous processes of self-organization and regeneration, their energy and matter flows are managed sustainably. As it often happens, thinking about different futures implies sourcing our inspiration from the ancient past. I could remind you of the forgotten majority of prehistoric human artifacts whose perishable remains have left few traces, not spearheads and hard instruments made for killing, but organic fibers, woven fabrics, and carrier bags, ancestral soft technologies that were foundational for our becoming humans. But today I want to tell you a much more ancient story. This is a non-human story beginning sometime around 400 million years ago. This is when, as a result of a fortunate evolutionary accident, spiders first encountered their silk. Silk is a complex biological substance as sophisticated as our most advanced technologies. It is well known as the toughest fiber in nature, but its qualities far surpass just being strong. Throughout their long shared history, spiders and spider silk have evolved alongside one another, adapting together as one to face their changing environment. Unlike other animals, spiders produce silk throughout their life cycle and use it for a variety of purposes, from hunting to reproduction, from traveling across vast distances to breathing underwater. The relationship between spider and their silk is incredibly intimate. The soft material is not just an instrument for the spider, but an extension of its cognition and an augmentation of its capacity to perceive and interact with the world. What would it mean for humans to become more spider-like, to engage with the materials we produce not as mere instruments, but as intelligent companions? I invite you to engage with the softness of spider silk as a metaphor and as a model for our technological future. Softness is my proposal for a speculative yet actionable technological paradigm founded on a renewed understanding of material agency. Inspired by spider silk, I propose 4 principles for imagining and designing soft technologies, artifacts, and infrastructures. These principles are fluid and plastic embodiment, self-organization, multi-scalar architecture, and micro-sustainability. To be soft means to be open to change, to be contained not by hard surfaces, but by boundaries that are always open to transformation in space and time. Soft bodies are fluid. They modify their shape and structure in response to external forces instead of resisting to remain the same. Soft bodies are also plastic. They allow the world to change them, retaining a memory of past experiences deep within their material structures. Thanks to its fluid and plastic materiality, spider silk can transform its internal structure in response to the impact of prey, modulating its mechanical response to adapt without breaking. In a soft future, our technologies are open to change. Distortion, deformation, and transformation are not design flaws, but resources for sensitive and adaptive structures. Self-organization processes are ubiquitous in nature, from the atomic to the cosmic scale. In these processes, materials find ways to spontaneously increase their complexity without requiring external work. As soon as it is secreted from the spider's body, silk is liquid and disorganized. The transition from liquid to solid takes place in fractions of a second and involves the self-folding of silk protein into a precisely ordered structure. A viscous liquid is transformed into the strongest fiber in nature in just a few instants and by a spontaneous, self-directed process alone. In a soft future, our artifacts make themselves. Instead of extracting, carving, and molding, humans foster the conditions for complexity and growth. Our technologies often reflect our vision of the body as separate from the mind, replicating a rigid distinction between components for sensing, acting, and processing information. The soft intelligence of spider silk, however, works differently. Its complex and responsive structure on multiple scales enables a close integration of perception and responsivity at every point of the material, without any need for specialized sensors, processing units, or centralized control. One of the consequences of this decentralized architecture is that spider silk is a highly resilient technology. When its structure is partly damaged, internal reorganization and self-repair can occur spontaneously. In a soft future, specialized components give way to integrated, multifunctional embodiments. Every bit of the body of our technologies is capable of feeling, thinking, and acting. Sustainability is often imagined and implemented on the infrastructural scale, but an ecological approach to technology begins at the material level. Because it is produced in continuity with the metabolism of the spider, silk is an exemplary ecological technology. Silk enables the spider to capture its prey. The protein it contains is readily converted into new silk. Some spiders even eat their spider webs once they are damaged beyond repair, so that the material can be digested to repurpose its molecular building blocks. In a soft future, our technologies are self-sustaining. Instead of relying on exhaustible supplies of energy and materials, they use waste as a resource and harvest what they need from their environments. Softness is still a largely speculative proposal. Recently, however, I've started mapping case studies of emerging soft technologies in different fields of scientific research. I've been surprised to discover that our vision of technology is gradually changing, shifting away from hard, mechanical, nut-and-bolt machines towards a growing landscape of flexible, responsive, and adaptive embodiments. Robots are abandoning their anthropomorphic bodies to embrace the flexibility of invertebrates, resembling octopi, worms, and plants. Water-based synthetic materials incorporate microorganisms and living tissues in new symbiotic communities of artifice and nature. Even computers are shedding their hardware and embracing wetware, becoming incubators of living neurons that can store and process information in much more efficient and less energy-intensive ways compared to their hard, silicon-based counterparts. Each in their own way, these emerging practices are experimenting with new ways of engaging with the soft intelligence of matter. Our vision of technology isn't just a description of how we construct artifacts. Often, it carries within it ontologies and politics, mirroring a broader understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Mechanical machines are reflections of a deterministic clockwork universe aligned with the needs of a dawning industrial age. In cybernetic technologies, systems of language and information capture and control the articulate materiality of the world. What different cosmologies does softness evoke? What would it mean to make softer technologies and therefore to inhabit a softer reality? Unfortunately, I have no time to explore these broader questions, but I'd like to end this talk with a quote by philosopher Michel Serres, whose words hint at the possibility of a softer future. It appears that life evolved from animal forms whose soft parts were inside, covered by a hard external casing, into other forms, such as ours, in which everything hard is interiorized as bone, cartilage, skeleton, while the soft is expressed as flesh, mucous membranes, and skin. Those who love to fight are unevolved leftovers from the very ancient past, from the dark time when we were armored. The newcomers amongst us will become gentle, wrinkle-bearing. We bear imprints. We are clothed in soft, warm wax. We are tarnished mirrors, a warped, scratched, lush, diverse surface in which the universe is reflected a little. Thank you.
We will now hear from James Bridle.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for this invitation. Thanks very much to Andres and Bajan for having me. Thanks all for being here. Particular thanks to Michael, to Anna, and to Laura, three writers and thinkers whose work I admire immensely and have influenced me hugely. I would usually give a talk like this by listing various extraordinary phenomena from the more than human world of intelligence and ability and agency, but I cribbed most of them from these three other people here with us. So I was going to do something else. I was going to talk a little bit more about the human part of the more than human and how I've found myself taking the things that I've learned from the more than human world and trying to see how they actually affect my life and the things that I do. I wanted to start by talking about the feeling of being more than human, the feeling of being entangled in the world. I live on a small island in the Saronic Gulf, which is close to Athens on the northern edge of the Mediterranean in the Aegean Sea, which is typically a very dry place. We have very, very long, hot summers, and we get little rain, or at least the little rain we get suddenly starts to come in torrents. The last few years, we've had an increasing number of what can only be called extreme weather events. This is the pattern that we're seeing already occurring very strongly. I was talking to a meteorologist quite recently, and it turns out that we're not getting much less rain, like on average over the last few decades, but the rain we are getting is coming very, very intensely in shorter bursts. So the weather itself is changing, not just its composition, but the kind of manner of it. This happened 18 months ago now. We had a weekend of storms, in particular one night in which we got the same amount of rain as the island usually got on average in a single year. And it was the most incredible flood. It was a night of storms. It was like being under an artillery barrage overnight that kept us all awake. And then we woke up the next morning to find the island completely covered in water. This is my garden, which should actually be grass, or at least dirt, a good 2 or 3 feet beneath where that water level is. And it was a quite extraordinary experience. I've never experienced flooding like this before. I've never felt like the environment was so violently dangerous to me before. I think we live in an age where most of us have forgotten that it's possible to be endangered or even killed by the weather, but it happens all the time. And it certainly felt like it could happen on this day. Hillsides like this, which were usually dry, turned into raging torrents. And I had this very, very deep sense that not only was this environment, which I loved and trusted, had sort of turned violently on me and on us, but I felt the whole system so strongly as being out of whack. This deep sense that some huge force had been unleashed, that the normal balance of the ecology that I knew from reading and from the news was tending in all sorts of terrible directions, but I'd never felt it so personally and so closely, that the entire system of the earth was in some kind of violent turmoil and was also struggling to find some new space. And yet within that, even while I went out and up the mountain, and building a house up the mountain, and I wanted to go and see what the site looked like, and even that was a bad idea. The road was in a very bad state. But even while I was feeling that fear, I also felt a deep, deep closeness to the earth. This came at me quite suddenly in ways that I wasn't expecting, but is undoubtedly a result of having spent the last few years thinking about my relationship to the more than human world, to other species, to ecosystems, and to the earth itself, through engagement with the work of the other speakers here, and through many others who thinking along this kind of ecological, agential, more than human turn. I think by that I was opened up to some way to also perceive this experience as an experience of oneness, an experience of connection at the same time. Even though this earth was raging and turning and moving, I felt a part of that movement. I felt a part of that change. I realized that I was deeply connected to it and not separate from it in any way. And it's that experience that I've tried to hold on to, even though it came out of this feeling of deep disturbance, of violence. It's the experience of oneness and closeness to the whole biosphere that I actually retain from the experience, that I try to hold on to. Because that seems to me the greatest truth of the kind of more than human dawning, is that we see ourselves as being part of this system. And if the world is in turmoil and out of whack, in whatever ways that it is, acting, it is also struggling to find a new way of relating to itself, to us. And if we are part of that world, then we too are part of that change. We too are part of that shift in relationships. And by shifting our own relationships, that is how we come to terms and assist this necessary shift that is happening. And I see this happening all around me now. This is the river behind my house, which for most of the year is completely dry. But for 1 or 2 days after the big storms that we have now, water flows in these rivers again. The whole stream comes back to life in a most extraordinary, crashing way. And you start to see that there is within the landscape places which have coped with these kind of events for millennia and are capable of coping with them now, even though they've been massively disturbed. The island is dotted with cisterns like this one, Suvalas, some of them hundreds of years old, built by shepherds and farmers over centuries and possibly millennia, to deal with precisely these shifts in climate, this abundance of water and then its absence. And most of them are empty most of the time now. Many of them are damaged and falling apart. And the great realization, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot in the last weeks, months, maybe years, is the extent to which these two are part of our necessary engagement with the landscape and the climate. In my last book, Ways of Being, I wrote quite a bit, to an extent I now regret, somewhat naively, about things like E.O. Wilson's half-Earth hypothesis, which advocates for essentially the abandonment of large parts of the Earth to non-humans, that humans really need to get out of the way. And I've just realized my mic's there. I hope you could hear me. I've pulled it down. I've realized that doesn't make sense to me, that we have a responsibility and care towards this world of which we are a part. And I see the effects of us leaving it everywhere. As well as the Suvalas, the island was heavily terraced. About 15,000 people live here now permanently. Previously, 100,000 people lived on this island, and no stone on the island has ever been left unturned. Walls were built up, terraces constructed. Those terraces retained water. They hold the soil in place when there's rain. They're the things that we've done to be a part of the climate.
And there's no excuse really for me or for I think anyone to imagine that we could leave this land alone at this point, that we don't have a role in what is in the changes that the Earth is undergoing. The flip side to the fires, to the floods rather, is the fires. The last few years, we've seen intense wildfires in this region, and the same logic holds. This is a picture I took from the beach last summer of a major wildfire in Attica, another one across the farmland. These are farmlands just outside Athens. If you've heard about wildfires in Athens or in Greece, most of those fires take place on abandoned farmlands. So these are not historically wild areas. These have been cultivated for thousands of years, but they've been abandoned through urbanization and through changes in human life patterns. And so we've abandoned the land, and so they burn more furiously. This is different to the patterns we see occurring in North America with fires where people are actually moving into wildland areas. In these places, this is about a lack of care, a lack of attention to the landscape. This is the sky over Athens during these wildfires. This is the sky over my island when the fires are, in this case, almost 100 miles away. And yet we're not exempt from the changes that might be happening further and further away. These are disturbing events. If you've ever been through a wildfire or floods, they're saying they're terrifying things to experience. And so they make me think a lot about what I do in this state of emergency, how to act. I think it's very strange that we talk a lot about the agency of non-humans, this kind of agential turn at a time when most humans in the present moment, include myself, feel almost a complete absence of agency, a complete lack of ability to do anything about it. The first thing I started doing, when not quite the first thing, I panicked. Something I did a bit later during the fires and these heats in the summer was I started looking online for plans how to build things like this. This is a swamp cooler. It's a little evaporative cooler made of a bucket of water with a towel and a little hand fan. You can adapt it into an air purifier as well as a cooler. This is a larger version that I helped build in Athens a little while ago, designed by my friend John Goodburn from the RCA in London. He calls it a Tower of the Winds. It's a large evaporative cooler built out of a piece of scaffolding, some sailcloth, and water sprayers from a greenhouse. It cools the air around it. You can cool large areas of the city through this through virtually no energy use at all. And I've found that through practices like this, which actually engage me with the changes that are happening, some of that feeling of helplessness starts to change a bit. I found this in almost everything that I've worked and built on. I've learned how to wire up solar panels and install solar installations. I don't think solar panels are going to save us necessarily. I think they're part of perhaps of some of the shift that needs to happen in the present moment. But learning how to do this kind of thing shifts my perspective, shifts my sense of awareness of what I'm doing and how I can engage. It removes the feelings of helplessness that are so often present in this kind of work. And I feel it puts me back in touch with these systems that I'm so concerned about. That's what I mean when I talk about flow, which was supposed to be the title of this talk, of finding what my place is within these systems. I build things like, this is a solar heater. It's just a black box filled with, this case, spray painted beer cans. When the sun hits it, cold air goes in the bottom, warm air comes out the top. There's no better definition of flow really for me than that. The simple transformation of our environment through low energy, low tech devices that anyone can learn how to build. That all of us, in fact, can learn how to build. And through building, we gain both a greater ability to act on the environment, but also a greater feeling that we can do so. This is a dew collector or precipitation farm that I helped build with my comrades from the Island School of Social Autonomy on the island of Vis in Croatia earlier this year. This is a water collector that acts by collecting the precipitation at dawn, just when the temperature dips below the dew point. there's this kind of magical moment around dawn when the temperature and the dew point just cross, and just for an hour or less, water suddenly appears in these dry landscapes, and you can capture it. That moment, that incredible tiny bit of possibility, that's where I find a sense of the future, a possibility for our engagement. When we're capable of just harnessing these tiny, tiny little changes in the environment. There's something in there, I think, in the softness that Laura was just talking about being right at the edge of the possibility, right at these, just the kind of few centigrade, few Celsius through humidity point gaps in the environment around us that we can find our little space in with, that for me are a kind of radical politics, right there on the edge of the possible that reveals an incredible kind of utopia beyond. And my last example is the most personal of all. What you see here is seagrass, Posidonia oceanica. Seagrass meadows grow worldwide. They're incredibly vital to earth and ocean systems. And when they shed their leaves in the fall, the leaves wash ashore in great numbers. Brought on by winter storms, and form these great banquettes on beaches around the Mediterranean and elsewhere. And historically, these seagrass has been used as an insulation material around the Mediterranean and elsewhere. If you go and look at old houses on this island, you can sometimes find, if you see the walls are cracked, you find this ancient seagrass spilling out of them. So we collect the seagrass on the beaches, and we dry it out and we pack it into the voids of the floor and the ceiling. This is a small shed, a kind of prototype that I constructed with my partner. The seagrass is dried and placed into the floor and the ceiling of the building. It's free on the beaches, it's sustainable, it's renewable, and I sleep every night in a building that's constructed, ensconced by this seagrass. A building, incidentally, constructed according to the plans of the architect Walter Siegel, who I'm sure many of you know, someone who believed that anyone could build their own house and provided for own frameworks and planning for doing so. I'm not an architect. It turns out I can just about build a house following his method, and I recommend anyone else to try. But the final point about the seagrass is not just that it's provided security, dryness, warmth, and a shelter for myself and my family, but through my engagement with it, I've been drawn back into the ocean itself. I don't just learn about seagrass by collecting on the beaches or using it as a material. I've become involved in its life cycle. So now I know when I swim out into the ocean, I see the state of the seagrass. I go and say hello to it. I go and visit it. Me and my studio are also engaged in seagrass conservation programs around the Mediterranean that we feel are a necessary part of our work now because we've engaged with this thing as material. But its real function is that it reminds me to always go out there and say hello to it, to always go out there and greet it, to feel myself as an organism alongside this other organism, all living together and trying to learn how to live better in this world that we all share and that we're all a part of. And that's probably long enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. I think the seagrass is probably a good transition to Michael, your work. Yep.
Yes, thank you, Bartian, and thank you for this invitation. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be a part of this Actioning Summit on the question of the other than human intelligence. But I must begin with a confession. Let me see if the PowerPoint, no, actually, yes. I must begin with a confession, which is that the term intelligence is a little bit uncomfortable for me. It's a term, my voice for some reason. It's a term that I keep grappling with, that I try to reinterpret as interintelligence, as an interrelation. that I go to the history of and look at the historical figures of epinoia as the ancient figuration of intelligence. And yet it still feels like a very instrumental kind of a meta-instrumental approach to the wisdom of living and non-living beings and their manipulation of the world around them. So very often I go back to the term thinking or cognition, and in this talk I will be referring to extended plant cognition, which is grounded in shared research with plant scientists, specifically with a Brazilian plant scientist, André Parisi, with whom we have been collaborating for a few years now. Now, you already know the story, and Laura has summarized it very beautifully for us. We tend to think about cognition as something internal, as something happening in our heads, or at best involving the central nervous system. The rational soul is physically situated in the head, in the thinking of Plato and Aristotle. And Descartes, of course, thinks of the human as the cognitive being par excellence. He's not willing to grant ensoulment to non-human living beings, and that leaves us in a very strange kind of situation where sensation, nourishment, and reproduction seem to happen without discernment, without decision-making, without thinking. So these are merely physiological processes that seem to happen somehow automatically if we are to buy into this sort of theory of internal cognition. But since the 1970s, the central nervous system has not been the sole focus of, or the locus of cognition. So if we look at the more recent theories of cognitivism and post-cognitivism, the mind is no longer considered to be a thing, a res cogitans, as it is in Descartes, but a process that happens in the living bodies and in their ongoing exchange with the environment, right? And so there is an adaptive interaction that is necessary to improvise when external conditions suddenly change. So this question of intelligence of other than human beings becomes almost a non-question, because if beings who are not human were not intelligent, they would not be able to survive and to adapt in a world that is rapidly changing. And changing ever more rapidly, as James also pointed out, now in the age of catastrophic climate change. So a life without cognition is impossible, and cognition becomes somehow tied to the three E's. It is embodied, embedded, and enacted, right? And so subsequently we have the application of extended cognition models to non-human primates, but the interesting thing is that plants obviously are also an important part of the picture, and they are not just added to this ever-growing circle of cognitive beings, but as I'm hoping to show very briefly in the time allotted to me, plants change the very landscape of cognition. They change how we might be thinking about cognition itself. So obviously we know from anatomy and physiology that the central and peripheral nervous systems are integrated, and therefore cognition necessarily involves perception and sensation, right? Just this very anatomical and physiological integration of the two nervous systems implies that perception and sensation are also cognitive. And we also know that seemingly mechanical movements, such as the movements of skeletal muscles, modulate our thinking. A key example here are fine motor movements in our fingers that actually mold the way our brain develops ever since childhood. So that's where the rise of screen technologies, the diminishing of handwriting is actually drastically affecting not only fine motor movements of the hands and fingers, but also cognition and the brain. And of course, the gut-brain axis and this intestinal microbiota influence cognition as well. And then finally, plants. With plants, when we talk about plant signaling and communication, plant sensation and perception, we have to recognize these as elements of extended plant cognition, and this is what I am hoping to present here. Now, very briefly, what are the three senses of extended in this notion of extended plant cognition? The first sense is that this extended means that cognition happens on the surface. It is of and on the surface. It is space-based. And so res cogitans is necessarily a res extensa. We very often pay lip service to this deconstruction of the Cartesian divide between res cogitans and res extensa, and I think that ever since plant thinking, I have been showing that plants can practically do this sort of deconstruction, and not only, this is the important addition to this argument, not only lead us to a res extensa, an extended thing that thinks, but also can show how a thinking extends and how an extension has an active capacity. So we're not only dealing with res extensa, but with res extendens, an extending thing is thinking. And this is what a plant is if we are to really put it in these strict Cartesian divides, right? So cognition happens not only in the physical or metaphysical depths of thinking, but right on the surface. The second sense of extended is that it goes beyond the epistemological limits of the modern notion of cognition and cognitivism. And so here, I'm hoping to show that we are recovering a certain ancient sensibility about the co-belonging of epistemology and ontology, of thinking and being. And if we go back to thinkers like Aristotle or Plotinus, then organismic vitality itself is understood as a mode of thinking. For Plotinus, for instance, the thinking of the one that thinks itself into being in all of these different ways, as plants, as animals, and finally as humans. And the third sense of extended and extended plant cognition is specific to plant cognition. So here, what it means is that extended plant cognition extends cognitive processes beyond the physical limits of a plant. So it's a matter of recalibrating our theoretical gaze, no longer focusing on the outlines of the figure that we recognize as a plant, but actually taking as the basic unit of extended plant cognition the plant and its immediate environments, both above and below the ground. So it's not only plant organs such as leaves, flowers, roots, and meristems, but also the interfaces between these organs and the above and below ground environments and other forms of life, fungal, bacterial, and insect, that form the indissociable unit of extended plant cognition. Now, if we think of plants as cognitive subjects, then it's important to refer to certain lessons from plant anatomy and physiology. And here I will be moving a little bit quickly in order to really schematize this and make the point very clear. So obviously this is a generalization, but I think a very useful one. What if we compare typical plants with typical animals in terms of their body plans, in terms of their lifestyles, for instance? In animals, cognition is oriented primarily inwards. They are heterotrophic, they are mobile, they move from one place to another. In plants, cognition is oriented primarily outwards because they are autotrophic and they are sessile. So different lifestyles then lead to the evolution of distinct anatomies, perceptual apparatuses, and ways of relating to the environment, and necessarily cognitions. So then, it's almost a caricature, but again, a useful one. A typical animal in a nutshell is a movable pack of organs, compact, minimized surface, relatively centralized, relatively few senses, and the senses are also centralized and concentrated in specific organs. Except, and this is an important exception, except the skin or the entire living surface of the animal that is multisensory, decentered as the organ of touch, but also of many other things. So this is the scheme here. This is a simplified representation of the body organization of a typical animal. They are integrated more internally than externally, so there are more channels of communication within an animal's body than between this body and the outside world. Right? And you can see what this implies in terms of the relation of this imaginary typical animal and its world and the cognitive structures that implies. In a typical plant, on the other hand, we have the exact opposite, a maximization of exposure, virtually all organs are in a direct contact with the external environment. The body plan is modular, so there is no centralization. It can grow depending on the changing environmental conditions in one part more than in another. It's called opportunistic growth. And the vital functions are scattered throughout the entire body of the plant, where every module is semi-independent. So there is not really an integrated, totalizing whole that would be that living being. So again, you have here a simplified representation of the body organization of a typical plant, where you can see that the channels of communication with the outside world and even of the communication of the different modules of the same plant with one another can be external as much as internal. So this emphasis on internal organization and integration that we see in animals no longer applies, and this holds very important implications for the understanding of cognition in plants and animals. So the crucial point here is has to do with the internal and external plant networks. Because of course, plants also resort to internal networks, for instance, to transport hormones or calcium transduction pathways, but they also signal and communicate through outside release of exudates to the outside environments, both above and below ground. And the interesting thing is that from the standpoint of plants, external networks are not treated any differently from the internal ones. So it's hard to tell a plant apart from its environment, because the volatiles in the air and in the soil are an extension of the plant, an extension of its cognition that is no longer within the parts recognized as the figure, the visible figure of that plant, right? And that is not to speak about the sexual reproduction of plants, who actually deploy non-plant actors from insects to the elements, the movements of air, movements of water, as further extensions of themselves, right? So all these are extensions of the plant outside its current embodied limits. And of course, this has really crucial implications for extended plant cognition, right? So let me briefly summarize these implications. First of all, the information processing model in its current shape is inapplicable to extended plant cognition. We simply don't have a very clear distinction between the inputs and the outputs, the inner and the outer. This distinction doesn't hold, and the entire information processing, this black box of cognition as information processing between inputs and outputs, no longer works. The minimal unit of extended plant cognition is the plant and its environment. So it's simply impossible to parse the two out. The fundamental question is not what is cognition, what is intelligence, but who is the cognizer? And the cognizer here is the plant and its immediate environments, above and below ground. This is what I call the strong sense of extended plant cognition. The unit, the indissociable unit of it, is the plant and its immediate environments. And the weak sense of extended plant cognition, just as the weak sense of relationality, is a plant itself as a basic unit with the subsequently super-added interactions with other biological kingdoms, other species, other environmental factors, right? So that means that extended plant cognition is thinking with the environment, is co-cognizing or co-thinking. And this is why I favor the notion of intelligence as intertelligence, right? This word that we, again, tend to internalize so much, and here the prefix in intelligence actually means an in-between, an inter-relation, right? It is an intermediate space from which we should start in our thinking about plant cognition, and then extend from there to the outside environment and to the plant itself. The intermediate space is contiguous with plant organs and can be really imagined as a second body or a glove body of a plant that envelops it outside of its immediate confines, right? And the same mutatis mutandis applies to certain animals, for example, those communicating through sonar signals that bounce off the walls or bounce off other surfaces as the animal moves in aquatic or aerial spaces, right? So the bouncing signal is this, like the second glove body, this intelligent body, this cognizing body that moves with the animal, but also moves with the plant in a different way through growth. So I know that I'm reaching the limits of my time here, so I just want to give you a really thought-provoking case study of extended plant cognition, which is self-inhibition of root growth. And here, the curious thing, this is based on an experiment that was run 20 years ago by Omar Falik and his team on the interaction of pea plant roots with their own exudates below ground. Right? So many roots actually exude biochemical substances to communicate to other roots and so on. These particular exudates are toxic to the plant that exudes them in high concentrations. So the question is, why would the pea plant actually exude a substance that would be toxic to itself? What happens is that self-toxicity becomes a tool of self-regulation. This is where the immediate space around the root becomes an extension of the plant body, a cognitive extension telling it where to grow and where not to grow. So when the roots approach a certain obstacle below ground, a big rock or a wall that extends below ground, of course the concentration of the exudates would go up and it would become toxic to the roots itself. It would kill them off and therefore redirect root growth to other more opportune spots of the earth underneath the ground. And so you can see how this self-regulation through self-toxicity, through self-inhibition, becomes an important apparatus of extended plant cognition, right? So the conclusions are many. We can see that there is really a shortcutting of distance constraints through this integration of the outside space with the plant itself. We can see that the full realization of plant cognition is only possible with an environment that is both shaped by plants and molds them, and this would be really the complete model of extended plant cognition, where we really take the entire unit of the plant and its immediate environments as one and indissociable unit. There are agricultural applications that have to do with soil health inseparable from plant health, and so on, but we can discuss all of this in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, and then Leslie, Anna Tsing.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to get to listen to these talks. And I think maybe I'm going to be pursuing some of the challenges that Michael Marder was talking about from a slightly different angle. So there'll be a lot to talk about. As he said, that term intelligence is slick and slippery, and it's important to me that it's mainly been used to differentiate children said to deserve a respectful education from those considered not worthy. Of course, the only way anyone has figured out how to measure human intelligence is to test whether a person's been trained in those forms of knowledge that elite white Christian men deem most important. So it should not be surprising that when they design machines to spit out status quo knowledge, we called that intelligence. Despite all this, I'm still disappointed that a lot of people who honestly love plants and animals can only imagine testing their intelligence by measuring how good they are at acting like those same elite humans. So many scholars still want plants and animals to talk to them, as if without language they can't be worth anything. Language is a particular kind of communication in which words as signals are carefully abstract. The word dog refers to the same animal in whatever encounter I utter it. And so we demand just this kind of abstraction from other beings if they want to be respected as intelligent. Amazingly, some pretty cool things have come out of this research. Leaves, for example, emit volatile chemicals when they're getting chomped on that allow other leaves to start producing poisons. That's great, and I'm all for learning about those things. However, it seems to me quite idiotic to limit ourselves to such systems of communication in which the measure of all beings is the value system of historically particular elite humans. What if instead we imagined intelligence as the know-how to navigate encounters? This is a kind of wisdom often materialized as memory produced in encounters. I'm going to use the rest of my 15 minutes to argue that material form is a kind of more than human intelligence. I don't mean form as style, that is form versus content. Instead, I'm interested in form as physical morphology. We don't pay enough attention to form because we humans, as well as our favorite animals, have set forms that stay pretty much in place once we're adults. Form is much more obvious as an aspect of encounters for shapeshifters, such as trees and hillsides, since they don't stick to one set form. I would argue that form is also central to human action and other animals, just as it is for shapeshifters. And I don't have time to go into this, but I hope this short talk inspires your thinking about it. Let me turn instead to two ways form works in non-human encounters as memory and as plan. Form can offer a record of past encounters. It's an archive. Since we're talking about intelligence, I'll call this memory. Form can also portend and shape coming encounters. Again, because we're talking about intelligence, I'll call this plan. I thought a lot about form in my work with the kind of fungi that wrap themselves around the roots of trees, helping trees forage for water and nutrients, and in turn, subsisting on a diet of carbohydrates produced by the trees. We call these fungi ectomycorrhizal. The joint organs they produce with tree roots are mycorrhiza. All you have to do to find mycorrhiza is scrape just under the surface of the dirt almost anywhere there are trees. If you have clay soil, it's a bit messy because the clay sticks to the roots and they break off before you can appreciate them. But if you're lucky enough to look in sand, you can wash it off and admire the amazing forms that roots and fungi make together for the benefit of both. Finding these forms was for me like entering a new city, an underground city defined by the encounters of roots and fungi as memorialized in form. Just as you might explore an above-ground human city by learning something about roads, neighborhoods, and public buildings, that is, its forms, I found myself thrilled to explore the underground city through the forms trees and fungi make together. Surely this city shows a kind of intelligence. Let me start with pines. Pines make two kinds of roots. One kind keeps growing as it makes its way through the dirt, exploring new places. The other kind's short. It's made particularly for the encounter with fungi. If the root does not succeed in meeting a fungus, it dries up and aborts. But if it does meet with fungi, the encounter results in a new form, a mycorrhiza. Pine roots have a special talent. The encounter with a fungus caused dichotomous branching so that all the short roots make the shape of Ys. That's the story that pine wants to tell about the encounter, preserved in form. The fungus matters too in this making of form. The flat, fuzzy yellow mat you see here indicates that this pine root has encountered dead man's foot, Pisolithus arisis. That mat is the story the fungus brings to the form. Mycorrhiza are form produced by the work of the tree and the fungus in encounter. Here's the fruiting body of Pisolithus. It can look like a dusty stump, thus the name dead man's foot. It grows in disturbed places, sometimes roadsides, although here in a former lignite mine in Denmark. I've even found it right near my house in Santa Cruz, California, seeming to be growing out of a rock. This points to another set of encounters in which Pisolithus participates. Its mycelia, that is the thread-like elements of its body, slither into the tiniest cracks in rocks and pry them open. Here, Pisolithus has created a fissure that allowed me to split a piece of lignite, not the hardest material, but hard enough. Here, the archive, the memory materialized in form, is the cracks and layers in the rock that have developed through its encounter with the fungus. These cracks slowly make rocks into soil. The encounter between the fungus and the rock is memorialized in the splitting and crumbling of the rock. I'm arguing that each of these two kinds of form I've introduced, the form of the mycorrhizal root tip and the form of the fungus-cracked rock, are memories of encounters. Form is memory. Form could be called a more than human intelligence. Let me turn to the second kind of form as plan. Here I turn to the feral effects of human-built infrastructure. That is, actions outside of what the infrastructure was designed for. Such what you see here is a canal which, against the design of human designers, has become filled with invasive water hyacinth, a result of the stagnant water of the canal's form. In the first section, I introduced you to emergent form, that is, form that comes out of encounters. In this section, I'm less interested in this aspect of form. The form of human-built infrastructure comes out of human design and human production. It's not, to me, a non-human intelligence. It's just human intelligence through form. But having created these forms, often as here, new landforms, the forms start doing things on their own, things the human designers either didn't think about or alternatively just didn't care about. Thinking forward with form shows how form portends and shapes coming encounters. I might call this a plan, that is, an aspect of more than human intelligence. The form of the canal here, the water encourages the overgrowth of water hyacinth. If there was any current in the canal, the water hyacinth would wash away. It's only when engineers create a stagnant body of water that water hyacinth gathers. It's not, however, the plan of the engineers to grow water hyacinth. It's upsetting them to block the canal. It's the intelligence of the canal, not the engineers, that brings on the water hyacinth through its form as a reservoir for stagnant water. While I could go on in length about this, I'll try to talk you through this point in just two more sets of images. Each, like this one, is from my current fieldwork in Sorong, a frontier town in Indonesian Papua, where infrastructure building supports the economy as a kind of soft power state expansion. There's so much infrastructure being built that there's hardly time or energy for figuring out how to make it last or to get it right. So this is a place where we can see all kinds of feral effects of human infrastructure building. That is, a kind of non-human intelligence through form. This water hyacinth-filled canal is just the tip of a very large iceberg. Here's the first set of images. In the image on the left, don't worry about the houses, which should just show you that we're right at the edge of the sea. I took the picture because of the road, the human-built infrastructure. From the point of view of its human designers and builders, the road's there so cars can travel easily on it. But its form does other things, shaping encounters besides those with cars. The photo on the right was taken merely by facing the other way. This road was built through a mangrove forest, but now the mangrove forest is being suffocated by freshwater weeds, like those shown in the photograph. Most of the mangroves have died. Only a few are still standing. The road blocks the influx of seawater into the mangrove forest, and so the water becomes increasingly fresh. Mangroves can't compete against these freshwater weeds, many of which are disturbance plants that like human-built roadsides. Despite many official proclamations about the importance of mangroves, which guard the coast against storm damage and rising seas, just building coastal roads alone ensures that the mangroves will die. The intelligence of the human engineers and builders is to create a hard surface for cars. The intelligence of the road, beyond the wishes of engineers and builders, is in its form. The hard surface blocks the water. You could call it a plan that exists through form. The form of the road as a hard surface presages its encounter with water and land. The form of the road destroys the brackish water mangrove swamp. This is its non-human intelligence, if you will, its ability to shape encounters. Let me offer one more image that shows the importance of form in world building. This is the seawall outside the Sorong airport. Seawalls are built to block water. Water hits them, making waves. I've included an inset to remind you of this work that seawalls do through their form. On the Sorong seawall, you can see abrasion due to waves hitting the wall. In front, the city has planted a set of mangrove saplings. Mangroves of this species have live propagules, that is seedlings hanging on the tree. And so they're easy to raise and plant. The tree does all the work. These saplings are young. They're young because every time waves come in, they fall over. The guy with the mangrove planting contract says he's planted 45,000 mangrove saplings in this place. Every few months, he puts in new ones. Because planes fly low across this wall, the city thinks it can impress tourists with mangrove planting. And there's corporate social responsibility funding. But no mangroves are going to grow here. It's a matter of form, or perhaps one might say, conflicting kinds of intelligence. The form of the seawall creates waves. The intelligence of the wall through its form is to block water. In contrast, the intelligence of the mangrove swamp through its form is to catch sediment in calm waters. The mangrove swamp stages encounters between seawater coming in from the coast and sediment coming from inland. It mediates across these flows of water and soil. It builds swampy land as a place for its growth. These two kinds of non-human intelligence have been pitted against each other here. The forms through which they come into being don't work well together. People told me that this was double protection for the coast, a seawall and a mangrove forest. They were not thinking about the non-human intelligence of form. They just imagined two things without attention to the encounters at each stage. In this train wreck, perhaps we can appreciate the importance of form as more than human intelligence. Indeed, it's a moment to appreciate the phrase more than human in the way I don't usually use the term, which I use to mean human plus non-human, but the other potential meaning is greater than human. Here, the intelligence of the wall and the mangroves clearly exceeds that of the provincial government. This is perhaps a good reason to pay careful attention to non-human intelligence, even if it's the intelligence of human-built things, which after all develop a world-making power of their own through form. I was going to wrap up with some thoughts about world-making and why we should pay to non-human intelligence, but I realize as we're moving toward a discussion, it might be useful to comment that one of the kinds of things we're talking about across the proposals, here I'm suggesting, rather than turning the entire world into technologies for humans, that is prostheses through which we get our dreams made, this kind of respect for non-human intelligence is a way of living with things that aren't technologies, that aren't human designs, but making our lives big enough to work with the ways that non-humans help to make worlds with us and around us. So I'll stop there, hoping that I've raised enough for discussion.
Many thanks, Anna, and thanks, of course, to all our speakers. To get the discussion started, we have 5 respondents, so it's a lot. I propose to start with 2 at a time, so maybe we can combine Michael and Lindy's questions and start from there. And there's a microphone, sorry, here, yes.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I know many of you have already kind of pushed on or challenged this idea of intelligence. And I'm hoping to continue that a little bit more. My question is concerned with what intelligence is for. And I think typically when we speak of intelligence, we're thinking of it as something instrumental. And I think for me, that seems to be partly a kind of Darwinian inheritance to intelligence. Something like humans are weak, but we're intelligent. But I'm particularly interested in non-instrumental intelligence, things like aesthetic intelligence, like who discerns what's beautiful, or ludic intelligence, who's good at games, or philosophical intelligence, like who questions what it is to think at all. And I think all of these kinds of intelligence can also be instrumentalized, but I think there are many cases where they seem to suggest a kind of excess of intelligence. a sensing or an understanding beyond the mere maintenance or propagation of life, for example. So I want to know what this might mean for more than human intelligence. And I'm not exactly interested in artificial intelligence, since it's often modeled on or measured against human intelligence, or I think, like Anna Tsing is saying, very particular kinds of human intelligences. But I'm more interested in the non-human living world or the natural world more generally. So like, what does it mean when puppies play? Like, can we really reduce that to just social and physical training? Can mushrooms sense the beautiful? Do crystals marvel at their own geometric laws? Or are there other kinds of non-instrumental intelligences that emerge from the more than human world?
And Lindy? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for that wild and wonderful ride. I've got some initial thoughts first and then my question. I think we all probably recognize that intelligence has become a kind of catchphrase today, like meaning or information were in recent decades. What we're trying to get at with these words are the generative principles that account for the operations of the world around us. For those of us in academia who began studying this material in the early 1990s as complexity theory was emerging, as well as the beginning of the so-called decade of the brain, one, by obligation, encountered the work of thinkers like the neurologist Kurt Goldstein, whose doctrine was that life proceeded through the action of integrative wholes, wholes being W-H-O-L-E-S, which was a kind of extension of the nervous system concept to all of nature. And also the biologist Jacob van Uxkil, who I know Michael will probably talk about. Van Uxkil's concept of function circuits was the operating principle on which his famous concept of Umwelt rested, and which implied that there is no operable distinction between organism and environment that merited further discussion. And then I'll mention quickly a third one that's popular with designers, the perceptual psychologist J.J. Gibson, who reconstrued perception as a continuous performance of variant versus invariant processing within a universal flux of which the subject was a part. For those foundational thinkers, the world, the thing experienced or perceived, and the organism, the perceiver, are always seen as indivisible continua. Some would even say co-generated. Question to all of you, or whoever chooses to take it up. Has the profusion of new facts and discoveries in science, nearly all of them, by the way, supportive of those theories, nonetheless had a tendency to eclipse some of the radical prescience of these core ideas?
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Michael and Lindy. Maybe to start with Laura, I think the question of what is intelligence for and the sort of perceiver question that Lindy poses.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are really interesting questions, and also it was really fascinating to hear the other speakers and learn so much. Yeah, I feel like about the question of what is intelligence for, I was really struck also by listening to Michael and Anna Tsing's talk, and also James Bridle's talk in a way, like this idea of intelligence going beyond this idea of just processing information, right? Intelligence taking other shapes and other forms that go beyond this model that we have of like intelligence just serving the purpose of adapting to or like, I guess, problem solving. Yeah, that's kind of a very rigid paradigm. And when looking at materials from my perspective, or I mean, I look at materials very broadly, like starting also from inorganic materials too, and moving on to more complex assemblages of matter. I feel like there is a tendency in matter more generally to create forms and structures that are not necessarily strictly adaptive. And also, like, I mean, I guess the Darwinian model of evolution is often criticized for being so connected with this idea of like the survival of the fittest, right? But also, even in the Darwinian view, we have a proliferation of multiple forms and ways of being that are not necessarily utilitarian in the immediate sense. There is a randomness, a contingency in the way in which matter produces intelligence and form. And then if we move even beyond the Darwinian model and we look at symbiotic encounters between different organisms or between living organisms and inorganic materials, then this even expands even further, right? So I feel like this idea of looking at intelligence as just merely instrumental is definitely a very limiting paradigm. But I also think, because my interest is technology, and because I think that as humans we really cannot exist without technology. This is, I guess this is my opinion. Maybe it's a strong opinion, but I guess this is where I stand now. I think that in technology, we could like also take inspiration from this multiplicity of forms that we see around us, even if we don't necessarily immediately see the purpose of that intelligence. One example I like a lot from the history of technology is liquid crystals, because when they were discovered first, nobody knew what they were for. And in the late 19th century, chemists, they just noticed that like these materials were self-organizing in these beautiful forms. And then only like so many, even almost a century later, we realized that these materials could also be used for certain purposes, right? So even like I guess looking at what attracts us, even aesthetically maybe, or what interests us of this like self-organization capacity of matter, does not exclude that then we will discover a way to kind of create a symbiosis with that intelligence too.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's start with Michael, please.
Well, yes, in response to these wonderful questions, I want to go back to this proposal which I made in a very schematic way of thinking about intelligence as intertelligence, about this in-between aspect that is not only a bracket, but actually a starting point, but also an end point. So what if we think about intelligence and therefore existence itself, because after all, this is what my talk was about, that extended plant cognition is extended plant being. There's being and cognizing are one and the same. This is my recovery of the ancient paradigm, still from Aristotle and Plotinus. But the idea of intelligence as being in the middle, as interintelligence, would imply that there is no end toward which it is being deployed. Right? This is what a radical notion of the middle is. To stay in the middle, to begin there, but also to end there, which means that there is no sharply delineated beginning and sharply delineated end, no purpose inside that would be achieved in this instrumental manner, right? And then intelligence itself as interintelligence becomes existential, social, playful, precisely on its own terms. Because after all, whenever we want to criticize the logic of instrumentality and of pure means, we always resort to the notion of ends in themselves. So there's the shadow of Kant always standing behind our shoulder, just as the shadow of Descartes is overshadowing a lot of thinking about cognition. But I think that the way to overcome that is really to dissolve the sharpness of beginnings and ends in this endless and beginningless middle, which is what intelligence itself is, a constant elaboration, self-elaboration of this middle, where different encounters precisely happen. And I love this word that Anna Tsing was referring to, encounters. They precisely happen in the middle, and they begin from the middle. So there is really no one pre-existing the encounter. The encounter brings into being those who are encountering one another. And this is what this radical notion of the middle or interintelligence would imply to my mind.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Maybe then, while the AV issue is being sorted, we can start with Marina, Marina's question as well, and Catherine. There's the microphone right there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was just a pleasure to be listening to all of you. I might risk being a bit opportunistic and trying to get something from this conversation that we can apply to what is happening right now in the last weeks, for instance, here. And I was trying to listen to what you do, perhaps misinterpreting what you say, but listening to Laura proposing to become soft bodies, being adaptive, or be open to change, distortion. Or to James, perhaps he was very explicit about ways of regaining agency and hope through these interventions, and mostly through care. And perhaps in Anna, I was looking into these ways of looking into the cracks and thinking that perhaps there is a way in which the form of the many walls or even data centers or rockets that might be built in the next months might exceed the intelligence of the engineers that are designing them. And thinking about that, I remembered a text by Michael Marder that is called "Resist Like a Plant," that was written after Occupy Wall Street. So my question is to all, but in particular to Michael, should we resist like a plant?
Thanks, Marina. Catherine, yes.
Hi, thank you. I got so much from all of those presentations. So I wanted to ask, thinking about this theme of more than human intelligences, which, has, I'm assuming, being conceived as some kind of reaction away from the kind of dominant discourse of artificial intelligence right now, so forgive me for bringing it up. But I can't help but in listening to the kind of all of the presentations and the kind of so many things that are kind of wonderful and fascinating and enchanting about these offerings of this alternative intelligences, and even the things that you brought up, Michael. I can't help but be drawn back into this notion of AI that is this very reductive mathematical modeling of human intelligence, so the sort of opposite end of the spectrum, you could say. And yet it's this one type of intelligence that, if it's true, is set to become this kind of general purpose tool like electricity that's going to kind of infiltrate every aspect of society and our lives potentially. And so therefore I'm wondering, with your presentations, how might we kind of just see that difference? And do you think of your projects as like resistance projects in this sense? Do you see them as like a political project? And how do you kind of see them in the sense of this sort of influence and scale and scope? And I just wanted to point that Anna Tsing said at the end, like maybe we just have to live without technology. So I kind of wonder what your response is.
Thank you. So two questions about resistance. Let's take that, and then we'll move to you. I hope everything is solved. Maybe Anna, do you want to start answering the question of resistance?
Sure. It's still doing this. So what can I do? I don't know if you hear me twice, but it makes it hard to even complete a sentence. Oh, something happened. Good. Okay. Resistance, yes. I do think that when we imagine the world as only being there for the benefit of humans, we're asking for trouble, and that trouble has come to meet us. So the beginning of addressing all that trouble is to notice what's happening around us that's not just the plans of humans. So rather than just making better technologies, it seems to me that we have to pay more attention to the effects that our technologies on the environments around them, that back to that cognition as extended into the world. I liked that very much, that we need to see if we could possibly get along with living and non-living beings around us without necessarily transforming them into our instrumental ends.
James, do you want to? Yeah, perfect. Yes. Okay, do you
Yes,
want to-
please. Sorry, I got cut off there, but yes, I would love to. I have lots of thoughts to all of those wonderful questions. Where to start? The AI came up briefly, so let's just dispense with that. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence, because intelligence is, as Michael and others have said, interrelational. So how can something be artificial when it arises out of relationships rather than out of beings, however we might describe those beings? There's no such thing as AI. I mean, and actually, but wonderfully, this subject has been covered by theorists of AI for some time. I'm always reminded of the words of Gregory Bateson, who, when he was asked if computers could think, said the unit of thinking is man plus the computer. He was already talking about this interrelationship of thinking intelligence as a relationality back in the 60s and 70s. I think he also elaborated on that to say, you know, as Darwin's popped up, you know, that Darwin made the mistake on the unit of evolution itself, that the unit of evolution is not the individual organism, it's the organism plus the environment. We have that whole, every single one of these kind of binaries, lines that we've drawn between beings has been a constant source of error. Bateson again put that as that these lines that we draw between interlocutors, between the beings that we've commonly perceived of intelligence, are actually the lines across which information and difference is transmitted. Meaning, information, all of that living happens into these relationships. What is not what this is for, it's not for anything. What's it doing? For me, that these meditations on the more than human, what they point to always is, Anna made the nice distinction between the more than human being the non-human, or the human and the relationships, and the human, or perhaps something that is greater than the human. I think that's one all sort of amorphous mass, because what extended cognition, or more than human cognition, or more than human intelligence implies for me is not just relationality either. It's not just a multiplicity, it's also a unity, right? You keep expanding that out and there's nothing outside it. And we start to approach what becomes unspeakable and innumerable. There was a nice half question somewhere in there about the way in which many of us are often following scientific interpretations to prove something that seems to speak to something beyond science. I feel that's what we're doing a lot. We all like to cite all of these wonderful scientific papers that do incredible work at uncovering things. Mostly what they're uncovering are things that we sense and are aware of, that science is one way to bring these things into our intelligence, but it does so only through the frameworks of existing scientific knowledge. And therefore, it is only a very, very partial view onto the world. And we can pick up scientific knowledge or computational knowledge or any of those other frameworks and use them as lenses to see certain parts of the world through, including the notion of intelligence itself, as degraded as that term is. They're useful lenses, but they're not the whole picture, because the whole picture is the unity. This ultimate kind of wordlessness that exists. And I say this as someone who set out to write a book about intelligence and then realized quite quickly that was just a useless way of talking about what I was trying to talk about, which is this multiplicity that becomes a unity. And at the end of that realization, to answer to the politics question, where do you go after acknowledging that unity? Well, then we come back down to earth again. Bruno Latour, I always think of, was always asking, where do we land? Well, we land right back where we are, on the ground that supports us, where we stand, surrounded by this multiplicity of beings that is a unity. And then having acknowledged all that, then we can actually start to act.
Tinny, we can get the last response for you. And also, I want to ask if there's any questions from the audience to already raise your hand so I can collect them. Yeah.
I'll apologize if my question's a little abstract, but ooh, it is weird to hear yourself when you talk. Just thinking about the vocabularies that we used across many of the talks, we use terms like efficient, sustaining, durable, resilient, adaptive. But in some ways, all of these terms recenter ourselves as the human in the center. They're anthrocentric terms, right? And it makes sense. We are humans. We are trying to observe these phenomena, these different forms of life and being. But we also go back to, I think, Anna's discussion about intelligence or the logics behind that. And for me, a question is, are we missing something by centering ourselves? So to take on Anna's challenge of world making, what would the spider, the pea shoot, the island, the pine tree, the mangrove, what would their epistemologies be in thinking about the act of being or performing or being instrumentalized? Or maybe in more simpler terms, if they were to write a textbook or a wiki entry about their epistemologies, not of Aristotle or Ptolemy or Descartes, what terms, what phrases, what ideas may they tell us as humans to think beyond human intelligence?
What are the epistemologies of the non-humans?
Sure. I mean, because I think starting with world making is great, because rather than asking, how do non-humans act in an approximation to how humans act, if we start with what are they up to and what kinds of histories do they embody, what kinds of relations are they making, what kinds of world features are there, that's my starting place to ask exactly those kinds of questions, is to get involved in those worlds, to see them as historical and therefore full of contingencies and new developments and unexpected stuff, but also making patterns and certain kinds of relationships get privileged, that I want to start there precisely because I'm interested in those questions that were just raised, is can we start on terms that are not human terms? That the way I came into form was precisely when I was working on those fungi. I thought, okay, they're showing me a way of communicating and being together that I didn't pay much attention to as a human. So I wanted to start with the kinds of stuff coming out of the beings themselves in their encounters.
I'll collect the questions from the audience now all at once. So I don't know yet. For Michael, so are there sorry, the question of resistance. Yes. So so please raise your hands, and in the meantime, Michael will answer the question of how to resist.
Yes, thank you, Marina, for raising this question and recalling the paper that is now maybe 12 years or more old, and that was written at the height of the Occupy movement. Precisely because I thought that political movement was raising something new, a new possibility of doing politics that was not really animal-based, or that was not implicitly influenced by the animal model of movement as locomotion, as moving from one place to another, the masses of demonstrators passing through the streets. Here was something different happening. The members of the Occupy movement planting themselves, staying in place, the movement itself growing rather spontaneously in some parts of the world, decaying spontaneously in other parts of the world. So to me, this amounted to bringing other vegetal modes of movement itself into the domain of politics. The movements such as growth, decay, metamorphosis that are influenced and really exemplified by plants. So your question, extending this to today, I think is really very relevant in the sense in which vegetal resistance really gives us hints on how to act in ways that transcend the confines of traditional politics, in ways that are not overtly oppositional, but perhaps even more effective than the oppositional clash-like resistances that we find in conventional politics. So this involves a very patient work of resistance from below, of often subterraneous resistance that is not visible, resistance that is committed to emplacement and to growing in a place, to nourishing and cherishing the relations that are established there. And more I'm turning to radical pedagogies, and the pedagogies guided by, let's say, the plants themselves as a tactic of resistance, that can extend another mode of thinking, both conscious and unconscious. Because when we talk about intelligence, we forget very often about all this thick fabric of cognitive or precognitive fabric that we often call the unconscious, right? And it is there that the possibility of change lies. And I think the pedagogy that speaks to the unconscious, molding and remolding in this patient vegetal way the unconscious relation to ourselves and to the world, is perhaps the best bit for us. It is this kind of ground shift or changing the very soil of the life of the mind, in which more overt human actions and projects and plans, as Anna was also pointing out, are actually rooted. Yeah.
Thank you. We're officially out of time. I'm going to look one more round. There's one question here. Any other questions? This is two. Emanuele, there one question. That's it. Oh, and here, three questions, and I'm missing 4 questions. Okay, let's collect them all. I think that's Emanuele. You want to start? I'm going to collect them all, but please start. Yeah.
Yeah, just 2 questions, but very shortly. The first is you described. First, it was really beautiful. Thank you so much. It was historical. Thank you for the organization and to the 4 speakers. You described 4 different ways to think, or 4 branches of this cosmic intelligence, in a way, and they belong to the same root, probably. So that my first question is, why did this, how can I say, original cosmic intelligence diversify itself into different forms? Why the intelligence of the matter produced the intelligence of the spider, for instance? Why plants, in a way, also nourishes other form of intelligence? And the second question is more like political, in the sense, I mean, perhaps the word intelligence is not useful because it lets us think that we are all the time intelligent. We have a brain, but mostly, at least me, I am stupid. I say a lot of bullshit and I make a lot of mistakes. And I had the impression that none of you spoke about this dark side of thinking, knowledge, which is mistake, bad faith, error, and so on. What do you do with this, with a demon, in a way, of our soul?
Okay. Yeah, there.
Hi, thank you so much for the conversation. I had a question, which is, I really appreciated, I think the kind of notion of the kind of flip between the internal cognition and external cognition is really incredible, and the idea of knowledge as a way to navigate encounters. And I'm wondering if it's possible, what might these lines of inquiry offer how to think about human social relationships, humans as organisms that relate to each other, humans, how humans might learn. And maybe the reframing that I'm interested in is not so much like how the non-human might be also intelligent, but rather if humans have lost a certain kind of intelligence, and that we might want to try to regain the kind of intelligence maybe that has always existed. What shall we learn from these ways of thinking about form as memory or form as play, or all the different ways the perspectival lens that you've been offering on how to think about the non-human world, what is to be regained or relearned or re-remembered by humans, and how we might relate to each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There was a question in the very back there.
Hello. Thank you all. Brilliant interventions. My question is very simple. It's just, and I want very quick answers possibly, because it's a stupid question. But to each and one of you, since you come from these different fields, what's your recommendation to enter or engage a new epistemology, a new intelligence? Because your starting point is that you're in your matrix, your ivory tower, with your notions, and so how do you engage a new intelligence? How do you learn a new language, basically?
Yeah, great. And then the last one here in front.
Thank you for the very enriching presentations, and I'm fascinated by the philosophical understanding of intelligence. However, it feels to me that there are blurry lines that have not been defined. When we think of intelligence, cognition, and awareness to a certain level, the lines are blurry, even though you have touched on the epistemic dimensions of it. But I'm talking now about the metaphysical elements and boundaries of those terms and concepts. When we think of humans, and I really appreciate Anna's perspective on it, that we have superiority when we actually think of intelligence. But in fact, when we think of the human will and awareness, it seems to me at least that we have, as the human species, we have the largest awareness that can exist, that we are aware of at least, in our form of communication and verbalizing it in language and beyond. Now, when we think also of the forms, it reminds me of Aristotle and Plato's forms.
But let's go to the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you actually realize and see that intelligence and awareness are a bit different, and do you see humans to have superiority in their domain of awareness?
Okay, thank you. So we have four questions, one on the sort of dark side of intelligence, let's say on social relationships, on like how to enter new epistemologies, basically, and the sort of metaphysical awareness question that just came up. Maybe James, we'll start with you, and I'll ask everyone to keep the response short.
Yeah, I liked the stupid question. I'm just going to take my headphones off because I'm hearing the echo. I like the stupid question quite a lot, because that's the only question worth asking or answering, which is, how do we actually engage with these things? And this comes out of slightly the question of, like, we're asked always, how do we recognize this? How do we know it's not centering the human? How do we recognize something too foreign to us? And I was reminded of probably the most profound experience I've had, certainly as an adult in my recent life, which is that a little over a year ago, I went for a walk on the mountain for a few days, on the mountain that summits this island. And I didn't take anything with me but a couple of bottles of water and a ground sheet, and I slept out for days and I fasted. And when I came down the mountain, I was frustrated because I thought that nothing had happened. I went up there expecting some kind of grand revelation, that I was going to meet the spirits, my guardian creature, something who would inform me of this world and speak of its own intelligence, and I felt almost nothing. Until it took a few days to process the experience, and I started to realize that I'd had a very profound experience, and that the whole time I'd been up there actively looking to encounter something grander than myself, the mountain had been present. The mountain was there as this vast, otherworldly, except utterly part of this world intelligence. And what the mountain was doing was ignoring me. I realized I'd never felt so ignored by something that was so present and yet so utterly uninterested in me. this thing that I'd seek out was utterly beyond me. It was the most humbling, extraordinary moment of both of obeisance, but also of this kind of more than human collection that had built up through all this time, through reading scientific reports, reading these accounts of different intelligences, reading about the amazing things that plants and animals do, and slowly internalizing them, changing the soil, like Michael spoke about, changing the ground on which these things emerged from. And only then was the direct experience that mattered actually possible to emerge. That is the epistemology. And the only way to really experience it is not through all these scientific reports and all of this talking, but simply to go out into the world and let it come and approach you, because it will. The world is yearning to speak to us and is capable of doing so at all times if we listen.
Laura, please.
Yeah, I also maybe start from this idea of like how to enter new epistemologies. I think it's a very interesting question. When I think about the spider and like the process of the spider and the relationship of the spider with the spider web, like I don't know if the spider thinks or would think about what it does as technology, right? So for me, part of like trying to open new views of reality and new ways of engaging with materiality is also trying to question established ideas, established boundaries. So we have looked at the natural world, like all around us, like animals construct things, right? Spiders make spider webs and bees construct beehives, and we tend to look at these things as natural phenomena, things that just kind of spontaneously occur instead of artifacts. What happens if we try to shift the perspective and to apply a category that we usually reserve just for humans, in this case technology, to the more than human world? And what do we learn from doing this, from like applying this, trying to make these transitions, right? So for me, this could be a way. And also maybe through this we can learn to question our own categories, intelligence, technology, things that we define very strictly and we open them up. And so this is where this idea of softness comes from. And maybe just briefly touching on Emanuele's question about errors and mistakes, I guess we see technology as something that must be efficient, perfect, infallible, and softness, in my view, also opens to the possibility of distortion, of deformation, of hysteresis. This is a word I like to use a lot, that we often try to eliminate from the way we construct artifacts, and that maybe we should try to kind of reintegrate to make or to engage with a different kind of intelligence.
Laura, Michael.
Yes, so first, of course, Emanuele, your question about why is it that this cosmic intelligence diversified into all of these perspectives immediately flashed the image of Plotinus again to my mind, right? He was really puzzled by one thing, why it is that the one had to come out of itself, had to emerge into this multiplicity, ramified multiplicity of beings that were still one but no longer within itself. And I think this is the wrong point to start from, because it starts from a kind of assured metaphysical foundation, which is the one. If we start in the middle, as I have suggested, then the question is answered by itself, right? We are starting from the interrelations between these different modes of intelligence as given, without constructing a larger unity, a larger whole, no matter how tempting that is, in order to think about certain integrity of the world. About mistakes and errors, in my last example, empirical example of extended plan cognition, actually mistakes and errors were the very first point from which the roots start, that exude these self-inhibiting substances, biochemical substances. So by exuding toxic substances, toxic to themselves, they acknowledge the priority of the mistake, the priority of a mistaken course of action that will then be corrected, but never corrected in a perfect way, and will need to be corrected and recorrected again. So I think that is very much a part of extended planned cognition, at least. With regard to human social relations, that is definitely not separate from extended planned cognition or planned thinking. I very much subscribe to what Deleuze and Guattari say about plants. They say follow the plants. And this is really a kind of dictum, I think, that we can put in life, in the sense in which plants present us with very literal, physical, formal, material way in which to think also about ourselves and about everything that is not so obvious to us about human intelligence, human cognition, human being in the world, that are much more vegetal than we recognize. And that, of course, brings me to the question of new epistemologies, which, at least in my philosophical training, really goes hand in hand with the living phenomenological method. The idea of not projecting pre-existing models, expectations onto the beings you encounter, but seeking points of access to them from these beings themselves. It doesn't mean that you will somehow unlock their secrets, but these points of access are infinite. But the key task is not to come with your pre-existing model in order to test it on the ground, but rather to seek these points of access from other than human beings, including plants. So I should probably stop there too. Yeah.
Maybe we can have the final remark from Anna.
Sure. I actually can't answer any of those questions better than what I just heard. So thank you very much to all the participants. In terms of the last thing that was Michael Marder was talking about seeking points of access from the beings themselves, I couldn't agree more. And it's, for me, the reason to follow the plants is the same as to follow the fungi or the walls or other things that we don't think of as our charismatic partners. That when we follow our charismatic partners, sometimes we're seduced into imagining them going along the same roads that we do as we follow what they're doing. And so the reason to look at, I don't know, insects, all kinds of beings that we don't normally pay any attention to is that in noticing their world-making activities, we have perhaps a privileged way of getting outside of our own hubris, that we know what's going on.
Thank you all for joining, and thanks to all our speakers.